It's my favorite conversation to have with the guys that set up our Motec. It's like, oh, all right, so I'll put the standard warning light for oil pressure at 15 psi. It's like, no, that's our idle. What are you doing? When it
Yeah.
gets really hot, it'll drop even lower than that sometimes. The oil gets real thin, but I've been told to my face, I can't tell you how many times, oh, your motor's going to break and fall apart. It's like, hey, we go rebuild it every so often and parts look great.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Sam Dobry from Dobry Designs. Sam specialises in designing and constructing high-end race trucks for King of the Hammers. Specifically, this is the Ultra4 Class. And I'll admit, this is a form of motorsport that I only had a passing understanding of. So it was really great to sit down with Sam and find out a lot more about what I would say is maybe the most punishing form of motorsport anywhere. Particularly for King of the Hammers, these trucks are competing in two very different polar opposite styles of racing. There is high-speed desert racing, much like the Baja that probably we've all seen. These trucks hitting whoops at maybe 100 plus mile an hour out in the desert. There's also a completely different element to their competition though, which is the rock crawling stage. And it's called rock crawling, but they're not really crawling. They're actually hitting these stages, these sections really, really hard and fast. And this is where they're negotiating boulders the size probably of your house. So understanding this, there is a lot that goes into keeping these trucks in one piece, because the old story is that in order to finish first you must finish, and attrition is a major problem in King of the Hammers. So with Sam, we talk about all of the elements of the design, the engine, the transmission, the problem areas, why certain things fail. We talk about using 3D modeling and CAD for the design, and also the validation of the truck components he's building using elements such as finite element stress analysis, essentially understanding that the components are going to be up to the task before they actually get sent out into the desert and torture tested. Now, before we get into our interview with Sam, for those who are new to the HPA Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to tune engines, how to build engines, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover race driver education, race car setup, 3D modeling, and CAD, as well as fabrication. All of our courses are delivered via online video modules that you can take from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection, giving you the benefit of being able to learn from the comfort of your own place and at your own pace. As an added little bonus, as a podcast listener, you can use the coupon code podcast75, and that'll get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. You can find a full list of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. We'll put that link as well as the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. All right, let's get into our interview with Sam now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Sam. Thanks for joining us today. And as always, we want to start by finding out a little bit about your background. How did you start getting interested in cars, and how did that journey work out for you?
Well, thank you for having me. My background into motorsports and racing cars and cars in general is pretty much, out of rebuilding my first truck. I had a 99 Tacoma when I was 14, and rebuilt the motor in that and did all sorts of work on the suspension. And that's what really got me into cars from a young age.
Okay, so you've gone down the path of building and designing off-road vehicles. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Ultra4s today. How did you sort of form that passion for that side of the automotive industry? We haven't had the opportunity so far on the podcast to talk about anyone about this side of motorsports yet.
Yeah, so I fairly recently have been involved in Ultra4, for the past 5 and change years. I actually got into it when I was at university, just watching all the different King of the Hammers videos and being a kind of a recreational wheeler with my dad, and we'd have a Jeep and go out to all the local Southern California trails. And when I was at university during COVID, I had a lot of downtime, and I was in Formula SAE at the time, and just decided I wanted to give it a shot trying to design an Ultra4 car, and didn't do the best job at it. Didn't know what I was really doing at the time, but I was fortunate enough to meet the whole Genrite race team. They have a pretty big, well-known Ultra 4 racing program, and I was able to talk to them and talk to them about my designs, and they invited me to be on their team. And for a couple years, I was doing race prep and welding and manufacturing, kind of getting the car set up for race season and testing. And soon enough, I was designing a couple parts here and there, and eventually their whole car.
Okay, okay. Well, that sounds like probably a more sensible way than jumping straight in the deep end and trying to design something you've really got no full comprehension of from the ground up. Before we sort of go further down that path, though, let's just rewind a little bit. What specifically was your degree? What were you doing at university?
Yeah, so I got my degree in mechanical engineering at the University of Hawaii. I did a lot of aerospace and material science research, and I did Formula SE at my time there. And of course, that was kind of the avenue I've decided to go down for since I was early in grade school. I did competitive robotics here in the States since grade 6.
Competitive robotics. That sounds really interesting. Is this the sort of stuff we see on TV or YouTube, at least, with robots battling each other?
Not quite. It's
Okay.
kind of like they're called First and Vex Robotics. It's more like a sports kind of event. There's a new game every year, and you have to, with your team, design and build something from the ground up in a couple weeks to go compete with thousands of other teams all around the world. As far as engineering goes, for high schoolers, that was a pretty great introduction.
Yeah, it sounds that way. At the time you sort of got into the mechanical engineering degree, what was your outlook on life? Where did you expect that degree to take you?
At the very beginning, I really didn't know. I really liked manufacturing. I liked everything about engineering. So I figured the experiences that presented themselves while I was at university, and with all the extracurricular kind of projects and jobs and internships that I had, I'd figure it out at the way there.
This is probably just worth diving into just a little bit, because there's probably a bunch of listeners who are kind of on that point of, maybe looking into university degrees and don't quite know what they're going to do. And certainly, if I look back on my background, when I decided to do a Bachelor of Technology here in New Zealand, I really didn't know exactly what that was going to lead into. And I know there's always this internal battle of, do I have to have the end goal in mind as I'm sort of moving into tertiary education, higher education? What would you say? Is there any sort of advice from your experience in your degree that you could offer to listeners?
Yeah, I look back on it positively that I didn't have a direct plan, and I wanted to go work at this company, and I wanted to go to this college and achieve this by 25, and so on. I was really just passionate about what I was doing. And I think that shows with a lot of the people that you work with, and they provide you the different opportunities or introductions to places, to either work at or intern at or do research with. And that is how every single one of my contacts was made, was just by showing up and putting in the effort and introducing myself to whether it was the professor at the university, or whether it was Tony Pellegrino with the race team, or Dave Cole, who's the owner of King of the Hammers. He runs the whole race. So it's really just about putting yourself out there and figuring out from that what you like.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably a little unrealistic as well, if we expect to have our whole life experience mapped out by our late teens or whatever that may be, moving into university. And I mean, I think, not that I went through the mechanical engineering degree, we've had so many people on the podcast that have, which is why it didn't really surprise me that that's what you said. And from what I've talked to other people about, the degree structure is quite broad, and it's going to give you exposure to a lot of different areas of engineering. And you can, over that time, start to see what interests you and what maybe doesn't, and then you start to build a direction. I mean, I think the other thing, obviously, there are some core skills and understanding, knowledge, etc., background theories and concepts that mechanical engineering teaches you. But at the same time, I think what I'd say is probably true of most degree structures is for an employer, it probably shows that someone's gone through a degree and passed, got good grades. They're not going to come into a job with all of the knowledge needed for that job, but it shows that they've got the ability to learn and to apply themselves. So I think that's probably one of the key takeaways for an employee. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think, well, I would always joke with my friends that it shows your ability to suffer, but just, enduring mechanical engineering's no easy feat to get a degree in. And I think that shows it more than anything, and what you can pull away outside of the classroom. I frequently found that a lot of the content that my degree held was fairly outdated by the time they were teaching it to us. So I was constantly looking for avenues to try and work in the research lab or get an internship and get that real life experience. And I valued that significantly higher than my actual coursework did. And I'm really glad that I ended up doing that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it sounds like a smart option to me. In terms of the skills that you came out of that degree with and what you've sort of applied, as we'll talk about in your current business, what would you say your core competencies or core skill sets are?
I think problem solving is definitely the most valuable thing the most valuable skill that I have. Just getting experience and understandings of different ways to solve problems, and how that's related to engineering is the biggest by far. And being able to really understand the mechanisms of what's going on and affecting and driving, and not just solutions or trial and error kind of things. That's the biggest part. And really being able to get a diverse background. I was very fortunate at my time with my degree to dip into aerospace, and I got to work on satellite integration. And really, they had a big program at my university where we were actually building and launching satellites, and actually had two satellites that are operational in space that I put together with a group of other graduate students and things like that. And all the way down to defense and civilian material science. So composites and ceramics and all those types of things. And getting that huge array of engineering topics on top of, while I was doing all that, I was flying back and forth from California to Hawaii, where my university was. And I was going to work our race team stuff and welding and building the car and getting all that real life experience in more of a practical sense. And then going and doing that crazy, you know, top level engineering stuff that you'd think about. And that diversity of expertise and skills and people that I've met and problems that I solved is definitely my most prized takeaway.
All right, let's talk a little bit about Ultra 4. And I guess maybe before we get into Ultra 4, for those who haven't heard of it, we probably need an understanding of what King of the Hammers is. You've used that term a couple of times already, so maybe start there. What is King of the Hammers?
King of the Hammers is a huge event down here in Southern California in the first week of February in Johnson Valley, which is one of our high deserts out here. We hold it's a 2-week long event where I think this year it was over 100,000 people total show up to the middle of the desert and make a small city with, power and, showers and the whole, there's restaurants out there, there's nightclubs and concerts, and it's a huge event. And we go and we race the world's hardest 1-day off-road race. And it's truly, truly a grueling race. It's called King of the Hammers after the Hammers Trails, which are kind of a local famous series of trails of the gnarliest valleys with rocks the size of buses, and 100-foot cliffs and loose rock and all these different types of terrain. And we go and we race everything. We do competitive rock crawling with the craziest rock races in the world are also held here. But then we also go and race desert racing. So you can think of Score, like the Baja series of races, or Best in the Desert kind of things, and where you're going down the desert through 3-foot whoops at 100 miles an hour. All that wrapped up into one.
Is two very completely different skill sets required, or requirements of the vehicle: high speed and super low speed rock crawling.
Exactly. Yeah. It's the low and slow for the rocks and the fast and loose for the desert.
Now, again, coming at this from a complete layman's perspective, I mean, I have seen snippets of this, of course, but I'm definitely not deep in this area of motorsport. the high speed stuff through the desert, I can understand that just being timed. Is that the same way the rock crawling is also sort of judged? Is it just a time to get from point A to point B on a really gnarly big boulder based course?
Yeah, it's a based off of time event. So you have a certain trail to meet through. You have certain virtual tracking points that you have to hit within the trail. So you got to be within 50 feet of or so of a certain point that. Right, you can't just take the highway exactly. So you gotta be, in the rocks and racing through the rocks and meet and link through a whole, series of canyons that change every lap, and, it's usually 3 laps long. That's what it's been for the last few years, and, every lap you're taking a different combination of rock trails and desert. So it usually goes, you take a whole bunch of desert in the beginning and then the rocks in the later courses, just because that's the more punishing way to do it. The guy that started this whole series, that started Ultra 4 and King of the Hammers, Dave Cole, he gets to design the course every year, and he purposely tries to keep it at a 80% failure rate. The attrition is the goal. And if too many people finish the year before, it gets that much harder the next year.
All right, so let's talk about that attrition rate. I mean, I can understand this is going to be very, very hard on equipment, but what are the sort of core failures that you see time and time again with competitors? The same failure mode?
Yeah, so in the class that I mainly work with, the 4400 class, which is completely unlimited. There's a few safety rules and that's pretty much it. I'd say the biggest failure rates are powertrain and drivetrain related. People breaking differentials, blowing transmissions. Transmissions and motors are probably by far the most common. But, breaking axles and every part on a car is broken at this race, depending on what team you're with.
Pigeonhole that down into three or four main things that you need to work on. It's basically from the front of the truck to the back, and anything in between can and will break.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the real beauty of the class is no one has a solid recipe. Everyone has a different builder. So there's a lot of guys like myself, a lot more experience with a lot more years that go and build like Joe Thompson is one of the famous guys. He has a UFO car, or that's his brand of car. And there's Eric Miller, and he has his own series of car. And there's all these different guys that have their take on how to do this race, and they all have a different combination. And then you get a couple different guys will take parts from here and there and throw their own solution together. So you don't end up with the same car or any duplicates of the same car. If you do, there's maybe 3 or 4.
See, that style where you've got a very open rule book, it tends to bring in a lot more innovation. And as you say, you're not just sort of seeing cookie cutter, everything looks the same, because someone's kind of figured out a recipe that works, and everyone then just goes, oh, I'm just going to copy that. So that's
Right.
always refreshing in any form of motorsport. Now, you mentioned Ultra 4 or 4400. I think you mentioned we've said Ultra 4, which again, bring me up to speed with this, because it's not a area I know a huge amount about. What is Ultra 4?
So Ultra 4 is the general overarching type of racing that we do. So combining rock racing and high speed desert racing. And within that, there's multiple different types of classes. So we have a 4400 class, which is the premier fully unlimited class. And then there's the 4800 class, which is not fully unlimited. They have restrictions on whether it's solid axle, tire size, and there's the 48, 46, and 4500 class, and they all have various tire size, drivetrain, or stock restrictions on them.
So 4400 though, that's the top class where pretty much, other than the safety rules, anything else is up for grabs.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm interested, just to cycle back, you mentioned you kind of designed one of these vehicles when you're at university, before you really seemingly had much experience in it. I'm interested, if you look back at that design, how far wrong was it, and what did you get wrong based on your current experience and level of knowledge?
So that car that I originally designed was heavily inspired from the work that I was doing. I was in charge of my Formula SAE electric team, and I was very deep into the whole electric drivetrain side of things. And I've off-roaded for forever, and I saw like, wow, this could really benefit rock crawling if you had independent wheel control and you can actually really accurately turn a tire and down to positional accuracy, instead of just smashing the gas and hoping it goes where it goes. And so I ended up designing an electric car, which was, I thought it was easier, definitely not easier, significantly harder to figure that out. But no, it was very cringe to look back at, for sure. Just it was fairly far wrong for sure.
Okay. I mean, it's expected, I guess. You go into anything where you don't have a wealth of experience and you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah,
So it's
exactly.
hard to expect. I'd be very surprised if you really nailed it with your first ever attempt. I mean, just on the EV side of things, obviously, that's growing a lot of momentum around the world in terms of adoption for motorsport. You mentioned the benefits there. No one's currently doing this. Is this a direction you could foresee people moving towards?
It's met with a lot of resistance in the off-road community, just because a lot of the community is based around being able to be off the grid and do it on your own, and it's very difficult to see that with an electric vehicle. But at the same time, you have this massive advantage with an electric drivetrain. So whether or not it's actually, a hybrid or whatever it is, having electric motors power your wheels and power your whole system is definitely an advantage when it comes to off-road. A lot of the primary issues that we have with internal combustion, is transmitting the power out of the transmission and to the wheels. And that is always a struggle, and everyone has a different recipe, and a lot of people get it wrong, and a lot of people break parts because of that. And
Yeah.
you're allowed to simplify a lot of that with an electric drivetrain. And you also have advantages where you could have a independent control of each tire. You can imagine if you're in the rocks and you want to pivot around something and tank steer,
Yeah,
that's a big advantage.
definitely.
Or locally turn one tire and not all three, and effectively do a like a cutting brake but powered. That's a big advantage in rock crawling.
I guess going hand in hand with that would also be developing the control strategies to allow all of that to work to the best of its capability as well. So I mean, that in and of itself is probably quite a big task, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, it definitely will be when the first guy starts to get there. I know there's big competitions like Extreme E, which are electric off-road rally style racing, but I don't even think they're really pushing the technology to its limit. They're not doing independent wheel control.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see more advantage for that high level of independent wheel control for rock crawling than sort of high speed stuff, rally, etc. It's quite an interesting angle, although a little off our trajectory, but worth digging into as it's come up. One of the issues with electric vehicles, as I sort of see for motorsport use as well, and this sort of comes down to the length of an event, is just the charge and the battery life. Would you see that would be a limiting factor for an event like King of the Hammers?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely the weakest link for electric vehicles and off-road racing, I think. At the best estimates, there is an electric stock class program that King of the Hammers is putting together, and I've been fortunate enough to work with that. But so far, we're at our best estimate. You're going to get 30 to 40 minutes of full racing potential, and that's not with a super powerful system. So for running a full length event, you're talking about swapping out batteries or some new type of technology.
Just to give us a bit of a line in the sand at the moment, what would be the run time for King of the Hammers?
It depends on the year, but like around 4 hours, 3 to 4
Okay.
hours is generally a normal time.
Yeah, so definitely a ways off that.
Yeah, around 200 miles.
All right, let's get a little further into the design. I mean, one of the elements that I would see being a bit of a balancing act here is obviously strength of the componentry is a real issue with anything that's this gnarly, this rough. But of course, as we beef components up and make them stronger, typically within reason, we're going to end up making them heavier, which is sort of counterproductive for the end result. So I'm interested, how do you balance that sort of weight versus strength and reliability element?
It's very easy to make a heavy car, and a lot of people do make heavy cars, and they're very reliable. Now, they might not be the quickest, but they hold together for the most part. And it is a very fine balance knowing the different failure mechanisms of whatever given suspension you have or drivetrain you have, and figuring out where to concentrate your strength increases. And a lot of that you can solve through higher quality material selection and manufacturing processes. And a lot of it, you just have to make it heavier. And for that fact, you have to really consider the whole system here. And especially when you're doing high speed desert racing, you have a huge, third order system, going on there where you have a car that's trying to travel 100 plus miles an hour and driving over whoops that are 3-4 foot deep and going over all these big jumps. And you're trying to control these 42-inch tires, and your whole wheel assembly is 150, 160 pounds. So you're trying to control these huge masses moving around, and you can't really have that lightweight of a car. And what a lot of guys more on the desert side of have learned over the years is that you actually have to have a heavy car to dampen the rest of your system. And sometimes you can go the other way off that cliff and you can go too light. And now your car won't go as fast through the big whoops. In some cases, yeah, and I found a lot of the sweet spots are around, I'd say, 4,800 to 5,800 pounds. That range is usually, that's your light to mid range where you want to sit. Some of the best cars in the world though are 63, 6,400 pounds for this race, and trophy trucks are even heavier. They're pushing 7,000 plus pounds. They have 100 gallons of fuel in there. They're really heavy.
Seeing as you just brought up trophy truck, and that probably for those listeners who are kind of not deep in this world, probably have at least heard the term trophy truck. And I'm just interested, can you give us a rundown on how the specifications and rule set for a trophy truck vary from what you're building?
They have a fairly unlimited rule book as well, for whether it's your T1s or your trophy truck or everything at the top level in the desert racing world. They have to have a full body is the main point. That's what differentiates them from, you'll hear a lot of guys talk about class 1, which is open wheel desert racing. But you'll see the traditional route is rear wheel drive car, solid axle in the back, IFS in the front. That's usually the combo. Nowadays, we're seeing a lot of all wheel drive cars. But as far as the rule book goes, there's not a ton that differentiates the two. What makes an Ultra 4 is it has to have four wheel drive. It has to be able to lock the differentials. You have to be able to have a transfer case that's capable of low range. But other than that, they have a couple different safety rules, and that's about it. Our 4,400 cars go race in class 1. So they have a fairly transferable set of rules.
Would I be right, just in the two-wheel drive versus four-wheel drive side of things, would I be right in saying that for the desert racing, maybe the four-wheel drive is not such an advantage, but I could see that absolutely being an essential element of the rock crawling side of the competition?
Yeah, so it's very new to the sport. I'd say in terms of its widespread adoption, there's a lot of all-wheel drive trucks, a lot of all-wheel drive trophy trucks, and right now they're winning pretty well across the board. And you gain a lot of acceleration out of a four-wheel drive car, and you gain a lot of cornering speed out of a four-wheel drive car. So that's the biggest positive. You do have a lot more reliability issues with a four-wheel drive car, but that's getting tackled every year. They're narrowing that down better and better, and of course it's more expensive. But when you are talking about the all-out flat, full-out top speed, it doesn't make that big of a difference. But the rest of the race, it does.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, and I guess as well, from you mentioned 100 plus miles an hour, but I'm sure there's also some tighter corners and maybe some lower speeds even in the desert racing where the acceleration, as you say, of the four-wheel drive would be advantageous. Let's sort of talk a little bit about the engine combinations, and again with no sort of fixed rules. I'm guessing there's a fairly wide range of options available. What's your sort of go-to combination and why?
Yeah, so our go-to combination for motors is it's a LS7. Loosely, we'll say it's an LS7. It's a RHS tall deck block, so it's a aftermarket block. Right now, we're running all pro heads, a fully customized dry sump system. It's all pretty much like a as built of an LS, naturally aspirated LS as you can get. In desert racing, you really have a unique torture test for a motor. It's not like drag racing or drifting where you're on the rev limiter for, a few seconds or at peak power band. You're throughout the entire range all the time. You're going through the craziest heat cycles you can imagine. You're vibrating the motor constantly. It's a full multi-hour race, so you're going to heat soak everything in the car. And then you're also abusing it to water, sand, dust, specifically for Ultra4, where our event is in King of the Hammers. The dust there is like talcum powder. It gets into everything. So that in itself kills motors every year. And so that combination of things is what really drives for the reliability of these motors while maintaining that power.
In terms of power and maybe torque, could you give us an idea of sort of where you're situated with that LS7?
Yeah, so that motor makes at the flywheel probably high 700s. As far as we test it, on the hub dyno, and we put like low 600s to the hub, and right around the same torque figures. It depends on the various. We'll change the setup very slightly year to year, and also when the motor breaks in, everything changes. So after a motor's 3 years old or so, and for trophy trucks and things like that, they're dealing with a lot more power. They're dealing with big blocks, 1,200 horsepower kind of setups, but they're double the price and less reliable, or more service intervals, I should say.
More service intervals, yeah, okay. I mean, everything is always obviously a balancing act, and high 700s that's no slouch for an NA LS, no doubt about that. One of the things I'm interested in is the power band, because when we just state a power number in isolation, it doesn't really give us the full picture, because I think this is lost on a lot of people. Whereabouts in the RPM range we're making full power, and what the torque curve looks like can have a real effect on the usability of the engine. I'm guessing, and again, I'm kind of going out on a limb here. I don't really know for sure that for desert racing, I could imagine a lack of bottom end torque probably not being a massive factor, but maybe for the rock crawling element, you would want a wider, flatter power curve, or torque curve, I should say. Am I correct here? Is the compromises because of the two very different types of competition, or is it just all in and you deal with it?
No, you're pretty spot on there. The torque curve, power curve, it's very positive. All the drivers are looking for the flattest curve you can get. They're looking for real nice, smooth ramps. They don't want anything peaky. That's especially why you don't see a lot of guys with supercharged or turbocharged motors. Outside of the additional complexity that brings, you have a very sensitive throttle, and that is undesirable in the rocks. So a lot of guys will try, four valve setups, experimental things just to smoothen that power curve out. And even if it makes them lose top end power, that's definitely something we're all looking for in the sport.
Yeah. Interesting you mentioned about superchargers. I could absolutely see turbos being a little too hair trigger. Obviously, sizing comes in here. I would have thought on face value that one of the normal screw type blowers that sits in the valley on the LS would actually have been pretty well suited to this. Clearly, you don't agree.
Yeah, like on a LT4, the LT series, they are actually gaining popularity just because you can get a crate motor and it's already at the power range that you want it to be, and you can go get it serviced anywhere, and you can put a warranty on it and all that kind of stuff. So no, those are coming around, but generally, for the guys that come out of the technical rock crawling world, it's naturally aspirated to the way to go. The sport's really evolving, though. Something that I've noticed in just my time here is it's less and less crawling and more really drag racing through rocks. So when you go watch, like there's some great videos, of KOH and these guys when they go through these canyons, they're not creepy and crawling and maintaining traction. It's pedal to the floor, bounce your trash all the way up the hill, and hope it stays together. And however fast you can do it is how fast you can do it. And just, close your eyes and let the car do what it does. I know that's what my driver does on race day is, he just closes his eyes and just sends it. But
And hope when you get to the end, or that all four wheels are still attached to the chassis.
precisely, yeah. Yeah, and I do my best to make sure that happens, but you can only do so much when you got 700 horsepower and a donkey driving it. So sorry,
Yeah.
Jordan.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, just talking about the engine reliability, you sort of inferred before that you sort of getting maybe 3 years, I think you mentioned, out of these engines. You also sort of mentioned some of the failures relating to this sort of talcum powder, dust, dirt, etc., out in the desert. From your own internal perspective, what are the sort of what's the maintenance schedule, parts replacement, and when you do happen to see a failure, what are those generally being caused by?
Yeah, so I'd say frequent failure causes are oiling related, either losing oil pressure, losing oil, period. If you have like a wet sump, a lot of guys will bust a pan. But a lot of times it's primarily fatigue and just maintenance failures. They're the highest end naturally aspirated small blocks you can get. It's very taxing on those motors, and so when you don't get the combination right, if you have a new motor builder that has a theory from his drag racing world that's very famous for not working out in our sport. But yeah, it's either you either don't have the right setup to start with, or you didn't service your motor recently enough, or it's an oiling issue.
Let's talk about the oiling side of things. I believe the cars that you're involved with are dry sump. You just mentioned that wet sumps are used. So obviously the wet sump can be made to work. What's your sort of ideas behind going the dry sump route? Obviously, there's more complexity and more expense involved with a dry sump, but some significant advantages. I can also imagine as well, with the odd angles you're going to get to, particularly with rock crawling, that trying to keep the oil around the pickup for a traditional wet sump could be challenging.
With as much modern baffling and oil control as you have in a modern wet sump, they last just fine in that route. It's more so being able to maintain constant feed and having that large reservoir for your oil, and in the way a dry sump works is very advantageous, and it's a lot more reliable. You're allowed to run a bigger, heavier duty pump when you put it on the outside. And there's a lot of different higher end applications that you can put together with a dry sump. And really that's where most teams go when it comes time to seriously racing is it's dry sump system. I know my team with the motors that we build, we do it differently than a lot of other guys, being that we don't need to run an oil cooler. Pretty much everyone right now has an oil cooler. And we have a whole different kind of style of running our dry sump and the way that we build our motors, as far as really low oil viscosities, low oil pressures, and maintaining super high efficient flow throughout the whole motor. I'd say it's we have a different philosophy, but primarily across the whole sport, the teams are running LSs with dry sumps.
I'm interested to just dig a little deeper into this topic of oil viscosities, oil pressure, and flow, because I think this is probably an area that a lot of engine builders maybe don't give too much thought to. And I'll absolutely state I am not an oil specialist by any stretch of the imagination, but I would say in general, the usual way of building a performance engine based on a stock one would be to take the stock clearances, generally build the engine slightly on the loose side of the tolerance range, and then probably run a slightly heavier viscosity oil than what that factory engine came off the showroom floor with. And my sort of basic explanation of that is keeping a thicker oil film, I guess, for want of a better term, between the bearing and the crankshaft journals to try and help aids some protection there. And of course, the other element is when we take an engine that may have been, let's say, 350, 400 horsepower in stock form, and we double the horsepower and maybe we rev it an extra 1,000 RPM than what the factory ever intended. There's an element of flex that we see in the crankshaft, all of these components that when they're sitting on the bench are rock solid and you could never imagine them moving, obviously under the forces involved. They are going to flex. So that additional clearance can help prevent metal-to-metal contact. Whereas if I'm picking up what you're putting down correctly, you're going kind of the opposite way with a very thin or low viscosity oil.
Yeah, so it's a very application specific setup. I would not recommend it for your everyday guy. You have to have, very high performance, built to specification engine parts. So like your crank and your connecting rods and all that stuff has to be what we spec out for our builds, is how we know it works together. In a lot of those high power applications, you are correct to assume that, those looser tolerances allow for more imperfections when you get shock loading and deflection. But in our case specifically, we find that since we're running really an endurance race and we get such high temperatures and vibrations and shock loading through the whole block, what you end up seeing a lot, you get a lot of premature failures when you run big clearances like that, because you push cavitation through your larger oil channels. And that's a big thing to do with oil viscosity. The thicker your oil is, the more that oil will want to hold on to those cavitation bubbles.
So essentially you're getting those bubbles pass through, and those bubbles caused by cavitation, you're saying, well, I'm guessing here, is actually doing damage to the bearing surface. Is that what you're sort of getting at?
Not only is it doing damage to the bearing surface when they pop, they're also significantly hotter. So the vapor that's caused, in that whole system is thousands of degrees. So you hold on to a ton of temperature when you run a thicker oil. And you'll see that fairly common across all endurance motorsports, is when they run thicker oil, they'll go down this pretty traditional loop of, oh, thicker oil. Oh, well, now I have heating issues and my parts are still failing. And I have a different part failing now because it's hotter. And then they put a cooler on it. And now you're trying to pump thick oil through a cooler. Now your pumps start to fail. And now you have all these different recipes of new failures, when it's really just your oil from the beginning. You can just change that out, readjust your system, and it'll end up working just fine without all the rest of it.
Caveat to this, though, is you're going to need to be dealing with high quality motorsport related parts to get around that sort of deflection or flex that I was talking about, that necessitates the wider or looser clearances in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're running higher spec parts than what we're actually putting out. And all of it is designed around reliability and pushing our service interval as far as you can get it. So, when you think about what's actually needed, when you can figure out your combination of high quality parts, maintaining rigidity across all those things, you don't need a huge cushion, a huge thick cushion of oil, it's not even really cushioning anything. You don't need that to maintain a hydrodynamic bearing. So what you're really looking for is maintaining flow. You don't need high pressure. Everyone thinks, I need to increase the pressure to my engine, and I need to run thicker oil. But what ends up happening is you run thicker oil, and now you do have thicker pressure because you have more shear resistance throughout your whole system, but you're maintaining the same or lower flow with your thicker oil. And that's what is the key to your whole system surviving. And a lot of guys don't give that enough credit. So being able to flow that oil as much as you can, as clean as you can, with the least amount of cavitation, is really, the simple truth to making that engine last.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I mean, this isn't sort of a really straightforward topic, because there's a lot of interactions here that need to be considered. So it's difficult to sort of really bring this all down to a couple of simple rules, because of course the bearing clearance, for all intents and purposes, if we're not talking about an external dry sump pump, maybe with an adjustable pressure regulator, the pressure is going to be a factor that correlates to the oil viscosity and the bearing clearance. temperature of the oil comes into this as well, but essentially, one goes with the other. And I think that's why we see sort of the direction is normally, okay, we'll go looser with our bearing clearances, but if we went looser with our bearing clearances but retained the original oil viscosity, we're going to see typically a drop in our oil pressure. So that's why then the oil viscosity is increased to get back to what is considered a workable oil pressure range, which is my next question. I mean, the general, I guess, rule of thumb that's always thrown around is 10 psi of oil pressure per 1,000 RPM. It sounds like maybe you're going against the grain with your expectations or what you've found. So yeah, what can you tell us about the specifics of oil pressure?
So for our builds, we don't really strain too far from that. We just start at a significantly lower point. So, at idle, our cars will sit right around 15 psi, maybe 20, and they won't do 10 psi per thousand, but at 7,500 RPM, we'll see 35 psi, sometimes 40, depending on the setup.
That would definitely be an alarming number for me to see in a data log if I didn't know better.
Yeah, it's my favorite conversation to have with the guys that set up our Motec. It's like, oh, all right, so I'll put the standard, the warning light for oil pressure at 15 psi. It's like, no, that's our idle. What are you doing? When it
Yeah.
gets really hot, it'll drop even lower than that sometimes. The oil gets real thin, but no, that's definitely a fun conversation to have. And I've been told to my face, I can't tell you how many times by the quote unquote best engine builders in the world that, oh, your motor's going to break and fall apart. It's like, hey, we go rebuild it every so often and parts look great.
I mean, ultimately, that is the proof, all the proof you really need. It doesn't matter what the generally accepted rules of thumb or what everyone else is doing. At the end of the day, if you're pulling these engines down for regular maintenance or freshen ups, and the bearings and the crankshaft journals are looking like they were when you put them together, well, that's saying that the oil is doing what is required of it, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's no proof like the parts.
All right, let's move on from the engine combination. Is really, as it stands, I wouldn't say anything too crazy or wild going on in there, just a good, well-built LS7. Drivetrain, though, because you mentioned that's another area that's prone to failure. Talk us through what's involved in the drivetrain.
Yeah. So for off-road in general, you're going to see automatic transmissions backed up by a few guys running sequential transmissions. And the go-to automatic transmissions, good old Turbo 400, everyone uses it at one point or another, and definitely still does. My car's got a Turbo 400 in it. It's a very high end reed case and built by Rancho Transmissions, and it's a super heavy duty, tried and true 3-speed.
Okay, so the best of the best as far as those transmissions go.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's super important. A lot of guys will try and venture out and try someone's new 4L80 or 6L80, and they're well known to have issues. Every once in a while, one will sneak through and finish, but 9 times out of 10, they're having problems on race day.
So why has the auto become sort of the go-to option? You did mention a handful of competitors maybe running a sequential style dog engagement transmission. Is this just for simplicity, for maybe the rock crawling aspect in terms of the driver not sort of banging gears all of the time, or is there something that goes a little deeper than that?
Yeah, so the range in which we shift is the entire range. So the entire anywhere in the RPM range you're shifting. When you're in the rocks, you could be on the low end. When you're in the desert, you're at the high end. In a lot of desert racing, it's a lot more predictable. So you know how to optimize your parts, optimize your shift points and all that type of thing. And that's where you do see the sequentials is pretty much exclusively in desert racing. You'll see like Albin's 6-speed, their whole series of transmissions, which are really awesome. But you have the traditional issue with a sequential transmission is you have to clutch in or turn the car off to put it in reverse, and that's a day ending issue in the rocks. So, oh, I shouldn't say a day ending issue, but it's a huge disadvantage because you're backing up and going forward all the time, hundreds of times during a race, and it's absolutely necessary to be able to shift into reverse on the fly. And you can't do that without a torque converter and it's a hell of a lot easier to do with an automatic transmission than with a sequential.
I mean, the other element, I suppose, with the conventional dog engagement transmission, sequential or H pattern for that matter, is the life expectancy of the transmission. I think is very dependent on the way it's being treated by the driver. And it's one of those weird ones where almost the harder you are on the transmission, the better they live. But dog wear, rounded dogs, and gearboxes that jump out of gear because the dogs are too rounded are pretty common. On the flip side of that, what are the common failure modes of the Turbo 400?
At this point, they've been so well dialed out. The frequent failure mode for that is losing oil. So it's happened to us 2 years in a row now where we've had a transmission oil cooler fail and puke out 8 quarts of ATF, and that's what ends our day. Or limps it, like this last year. We had to band-aid some stuff back together and keep filling through the dipstick as we made it back to change out a cooler. But that's generally the failure mode. Or if you have an exorbitant amount of power, if you got a Danzy, one of the super high-end off-road big blocks that are putting down 1200 horsepower, then you can break a transmission. But for the most part, for the guys running the small blocks, running the LSs, it'll take anything you can throw at it, and a bunch of temperature too. They're very reliable.
All right, so I'm guessing from the back of the transmission, you're sort of running into a transfer case. Is that right? So talk us through the rest of the drivetrain.
Yeah, so for our sport, you're required to have a transfer case. That's one of the few rules. And so there's lots of guys running different types of transmission or transfer cases. We specifically run an Atlas transfer case, which is anyone can go buy one right now. They have a race version, and that's what we pick up. That's all there is to it. Super simple. You have a high and a low range, and you can engage front or rear wheel drive, or put them all driving at the same time. And that's as simple as it gets for our transfer cases. They're pretty reliable. We have had them fail in the past, but it's not really a common occurring issue.
So a freak occurrence more than anything if one of those was to fail.
Yeah.
When you've got those in four-wheel drive, is there a differential action, be it open or limited slip, between the front and the rear torque output, or is it just a fixed split 50-50 front and rear, locked essentially?
It's fixed. It's they're mechanically coupled on the same piece. There's no clutch. There's no damping in between them. It's how it needs to be for rock crawling. You have to have equal distribution.
Okay, all right. So then we've got power moving its way forward and rearward to the front and rear axles. Again, what's the options here? Because as I understand it, there's combinations running live and independent axles front and rear, and no sort of clear-cut way on which is the best. So I'm interested in your take on that.
Yeah, so there's the solid axle gang, which is how the whole competition started, and how a lot of guys still run, and some guys still win with a solid axle car. And that's just like your normal Jeep. That's always been that way. Nothing really too different. Everyone pretty much runs a third member style axle. So run it down to your third member, and that's pretty much it. For a newer style car is the IFS car, so independent front, solid axle rear.
Okay.
And so those guys have again, either a totally removable third member that's built into the front bulkhead, or a completely removable differential. Otherwise, it's fairly simple. It's just your ring and pinion and whatever type of either differential or a spool, which is just a mechanically linked, both ways, which is very common because of how reliable they are. Or you have a locker in there, so you could have all different types of lockers, electronic, pneumatic lockers. There's the Detroit style lockers, which everyone who's had a Jeep or any type of off-road cars has seen and heard about those. And in some specialty cases, you can get one-way lockers, so they lock up under forward load and unlock offload, which is, in my opinion, that's the best thing you can have in the front. So you get power when you're trying to gain traction, and then when you're trying to break into a corner, your wheels open up and they can, rotate at whatever speed they want to, which is, helpful in braking in a corner.
Yeah, I was going to ask about those different styles of differential, particularly with the spool. I could imagine it being super effective for lower speed rock crawling types of use, but I can only imagine it being diabolical for turn and understeer as well, and the higher speed stuff on the desert. So that sort of gets to what you were talking about with the one-way locker. It's going to have drive when you're under acceleration, but open up and act like an open differential so that the car will still turn in nicely.
Exactly. Yeah. So, it's also a give and take with a spool when you're rock crawling, because when you have a spool, you can't run cutting brakes,
Mm,
because now
mm,
you're mechanically coupling each side, so you can't do, all the different tricks that rock crawlers like to do, and you can't lock and unlock. Sometimes you want to be able to turn tighter, and that's harder to do with a spool. And so if you have a selectable locker, you can pop the front open and turn easier. So yeah, there's all sorts of trade-offs. Are you trying to go reliable, performance oriented, all those sorts of things. So the combo that we run in my car in the front is it's a selectable one way.
okay.
So there's a ARB pneumatic locker in the front, so we can close everything up. So we have, locked front and forward and reverse drive, and then you take the pressure off, and now it's just a normal one way. So that's kind of, in my opinion, for this race, it's the best combination you can have in the front, as long as you can get it to live.
Yeah. I guess there's also the consideration of the workload for the driver. If he's got a lot more, he or she has got a lot more factors that need to be manipulated on and off, etc. That's going to take some concentration as well and a different skill set. Am I right?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, you gotta go test and figure out how to drive your car. But I think the more options you have, it's definitely nicer when you think you're stuck on an obstacle, or something's really sketchy and you wish you could be, turn 10 degrees to the left or something like that.
Yeah.
It's always, you always wish you have that next option, and it only takes one obstacle on the side of a cliff for you to say, oh, I want cutting brakes on my next car.
So you just use that term cutting brakes. I'm going to guess it sort of might align with what I've heard referred to as fiddle brakes with individual braking for the different corners of the car. Am I right, or is that a different technology?
No, yeah, that's the same thing.
Okay, cool. So I guess for those, again, who are really fresh to this, what are these cutting brakes? Why would you install them? And obviously, some have them, some don't. So again, no clear direction that this is the way you must go.
Yeah, so it's definitely something out of the competitive rock crawling world, for our sport at least. But it's everyone's heard of and seen, the rear hydraulic brakes for the back when you're trying to drift. Everyone's seen that. So it's essentially that, but for the left and the right side, or for independent corners. So if you get up on an obstacle and you want to pivot around that, you can hold on to, whatever corner is on that obstacle, and drive around that tire. So it's useful for the real technical stuff and the experienced driver, and someone that's willing to have a combination of parts that will allow for them.
Yeah, okay. All right. Now, I'm interested why the direction of independent front suspension, but still the solid axle for the rear. Why not just go all in and go independent front and rear?
Yeah, so I said the same thing, and I'm a big supporter of that question. And I think independent front and rear is my personal way to go. It is definitely more complicated and requires more service, but you get to pick different lines. And I don't think a lot of people give it that much credit. But when you're going through these races, everyone has to take a certain line to get their differential out of the way of, a rock over here, or get something up and over this way. And when you have a fully independent car, you're kind of like a big ski. You can put the huge rocks right underneath the bottom of your car and just goose it right over the top. And it allows you to crawl in a different way. It's a lot more aggressive, but I think it's, at the end of the day, just as fast. And it's a huge benefit in the desert, It's so much smoother and so much faster, and corners so much better.
Yeah, I could imagine some pros and cons here, and absolutely what you've said there, the complexity of an independent suspension system. There's no arguing that there's a lot more moving parts and a lot more going on than a conventional live axle. Just in terms of the performance in the desert, in particular, you've mentioned earlier these sort of 3 or 4 foot high whoops that you're running over at 100+ mph, and probably most people listening have watched videos of these cars doing exactly that, and watching them blaze through these whoops at insane speed, and the body's just absolutely rock solid, and you're just watching the articulation of these wheels, probably 14+ inches of travel or whatever that they're doing up and down. It's quite impressive to see. And a lot of the sort of the ability of the wheels to track these bumps will come down to the unsprung weight. And there's no argument here, the unsprung weight of an independent suspension system versus a live axle, it's going to win there. Is that a consideration, or does it really just not make that much difference?
It's not just the weight, right? When you're looking at that whole system, you care about your inertial rate through the whole system. So you're not only dealing with less weight per corner, for what your shocks have to deal with, but you also have a shorter lever over which that travels. So it's a order of magnitude less for that system to deal with. So that allows you to run smaller shocks. It allows the shocks to stay cooler, and really do their, be focused more on doing their job than cycling, getting the heat out of the oil, and dealing with all the issues that arise from that.
Yeah.
And that definitely is a huge just mechanics advantage. But outside of that, being able to uncouple the rear, it just really smoothens out the ride. So like I've been fortunate enough to go in our fully independent car and some IFS cars, and the fully independent car, it's very it's almost lackluster when you get in it and you're doing 115, 120 miles an hour through the desert, because it feels like you're, on the freeway. It's that smooth. It's really kind of like you're amazed, but at the same time, like, oh, I thought this was going to be more of a roller coaster ride than it is.
Yeah.
Versus, a solid rear axle car, it's moving around a lot more. And when you're talking about, cycling 25 inches of suspension, it's really, you can see the tire pop up above the hood, and then you can feel the limit strap bounce on the next one. And you're just sitting there, all strapped in, not moving. And it's really a weird experience. But yeah, the fully independent car is it's a lot more seated. It's a lot flatter. It's a lot more comfortable to drive.
Okay. All right. In terms of ground clearance as well, you mentioned, particularly with the solid axle, the clearance to the axle is obviously a consideration with the rock crawling. Now, I understand as well you run portals on the axles to increase essentially the clearance to the differential. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it does. Portals do a bunch of different things.
Okay.
It's not just a clearance
There's a ratio in here as
additive.
well. Yes.
Right, you got a gearbox sitting at the outside, so you take a bunch of load off your axles, off your CVs, which are another one of those high frequency failure points is
Mm.
CVs. You also take a bunch of load off your differential, so you can run a higher ratio. So you're not dealing with you'll hear frequently guys complaining of, oh, I blew up my pinion, because they're running a real large ratio. They're running 533s or something crazy. And on our cars, we can run like roughly a 3-to-1. Huge pinion gears, and so it's super bulletproof all the way out to the portal. Now, with the portal, there are a lot of maintenance. Just common theme here, right? Fully independent, more maintenance. Portals, more maintenance. It's a lot of maintenance for this car, but you get all that additional reduction, and you can also pull a lot more steering out of a portaled car because you have less load on your CVs. And so that's the trade-off with the CV. Is it's not just like I can get 40 degrees out of my CV and that's it. No, that's a chart that goes over load. So you can put more angle into your CV if you put less load into it. If you go and talk with these companies, they can provide you those types of things, or some of it's out there publicly. But yeah, so when you do stuff like that, when you get portals, you get steering advantage.
Okay. Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. Is there a trade-off here as well with the, how would you put it, ride height, I guess, of the truck versus center of gravity of the truck? And how do you sort of walk that tightrope, if so?
Yeah, so the ride height matters a lot when you're talking about, a FIS car with a solid axle in the rear, because you're trying to, be able to put enough rocks, under you to be able to maneuver to get your solid axle in the rear out of the way and get the tire up on those. But when you're talking about a fully independent car, it's not the biggest consideration. Our car actually kind of sits lower. I wouldn't say it's super low, but it's like 19 inches belly height, which doesn't sound like the craziest thing in the world, but all these cars, just a factor of running such long travel suspension is you get very large jacking forces when you get on the gas. So you can intentionally raise your car by standing on the throttle
Right.
and raise your center of mass just by binding up the whole drivetrain.
Yeah, okay.
Um, so that's another factor that goes in, as far as suspension geometry goes. People require, like, some racers like a certain type of geometry that allows them to get a higher jacking force because that's a
Yeah.
part of the way they drive.
Yeah, that's probably not something that would have been immediately obvious or intuitive, but yeah, I can see how that could be used to the driver's advantage. All right, let's talk about the design of these trucks. I mean, you already said you designed one in university. These days, what are you using to design them? And I'm sure it's safe to assume that everything's being done in CAD, but what specific software are you using? What have you settled on?
Yeah, so I'm a SolidWorks kid. They got me with the free education license early on. No, but I mean, it doesn't really matter which one you use, but SolidWorks is my drug of choice here. It's a great tool. I'm very fond of it. The way that I can design a car is very specific to SolidWorks, and the way that I can design all of my geometries essentially in these big sketch workbooks with all these different kinds of 3D sketches and different types of constraints, and I can model fully articulated steering and travel and all these different things and make all these driven features in the program. It makes it really easy and quick for me to design suspension geometries without having to go through and kind of do the math and line up certain features every time. It's really just a like a calculator essentially, where I put in the parameters and it spits out the geometry I want.
And in terms of that aspect of CAD, how much quicker is it now for a design sort of iteration for a suspension component like that when you're talking about geometry changes versus what it would have been like? And I'm guessing what it would have been like is before your time anyway, but doing it sort of in a more manual way.
Yeah, well, I think the guys back in the day that would do it manually, there was so much that they couldn't have known. With all these geometries, there's so much kind of air that they can sustain.
Mm.
So you can have, pretty terrible angles with, caster or with scrub radius and all these different things. And you really won't notice it because you're running a 40-inch tire with a 17-inch rim. You got a ton of sidewall
Yeah.
and you're running low pressure. So your tire is deflecting 8 inches each way.
So the geometry is not as critical as it would be for a road race application, for example.
Absolutely. There's no such thing as a constant contact patch in off road.
Just wanted to take a moment out of our interview with Sam and talk about a course that I think you'll really love if you've enjoyed this interview, and that is our 3D modeling and CAD course. Obviously, we've talked to Sam a fair bunch today in this episode about how CAD has really changed the game in terms of designing these trucks and understanding that everything is going to work as expected when the cars or trucks are constructed. And CAD has become pivotal in just about any form of high-end motorsport. These days, CAD and 3D modeling has become more and more accessible to the average home enthusiast, not least of all because the likes of Fusion 360 makes this software free for personal use. This expands the range of tasks that the average home enthusiast can perform on their car or truck, and also means that you've got access to a lot more tools at your fingertips. But understanding how to use them obviously is critical. That's where this course comes in. You'll learn about the basics of CAD as well as the design fundamentals. Having an understanding of what you're designing and the forces involved is really critical before you actually start making any components. You'll learn the basics of solid modeling, including 2D and 3D sketches, datums, extrudes and holes, revolves, sweeps and piping and lofts, just to name a few. We'll also cover sheet metal modeling basics, which is another really key element of the current crop of 3D modeling software packages, perfect for making brackets or the like for your particular project. You'll learn about how to convert your model to sheet metal, bends, flanges, flat patterns, and bend back. You'll learn about assemblies as well, how to actually construct assemblies in 3D modeling software. We also cover some of the analysis of the parts you're designing, geometry, measurements, and mass analysis tools such as finite element analysis. You'll learn also about motion and contact analysis of your assemblies. Also cover post-processing of your parts, dimensions and tolerances, drawing notes and other specifications, output files for manufacturing, and then cover some of the more advanced CAD functions such as surface modeling. I already mentioned finite element analysis. We cover generative design and automated modeling, as well as computer-aided manufacturing. We also touch on 3D scanning and printing. Key element here though, once you've learned all of those skills, we also present a nice, easy to follow 5-step CAD design process that you can apply to your own parts that you want to design and manufacture at home. Because you have listened to this podcast, you can also use the coupon code Dobry25, and that'll get you 25% off our 3D modeling and CAD course. As usual, we'll put a link to that coupon code as well as the course in our show notes. Let's get back to our interview now. In terms of the design and construction, once you've sort of got a full working CAD model, you're absolutely comfortable with all of the componentry and everything sort of locked in, you're ready to go. From there, what is the construction process looking like? I mean, are you leaning on technologies like CNC cutting and bending of the tube for the chassis, or is that still being done by hand?
Yeah, so pretty much exclusively it's going to be laser cut, CNC mandrel bent, and that's all fixtured with CNC laser cut plates on a fixture table, and that's pretty much the way that I personally build cars, and how pretty much everyone in the sport does at this point. You know, you still got some real artisan guys out there doing everything by hand, but they're definitely few and far between in comparison.
I'm guessing one of the advantages with this technique that you're using is a guaranteed fitment, and if you're building two chassis, for all intents and purposes, they are going to come out absolutely identical.
I wouldn't say absolutely identical. They definitely have tolerances looser than you'd hope sometimes, but generally you're going to get way closer, way quicker. So like I'll go finish a design, spit out a cut list, and 2 weeks later I'll have every tube coped, cut, bent as pretty darn close to what I want. And I can key and notch my tubes too. So I could put certain locating features in them so that they snap together in
Right.
the correct position instead of me having to square things up and line them up and measure. It allows the actual manufacturing process, the fitting process of that chassis to happen a lot faster. And they're really, it's not that expensive as it used to be. There's so many job shops out there with all this equipment that it's a lot more attainable to even your backyard builder.
Yeah, I mean, we've had plenty on the podcast who maybe not quite going to the point of CNC manual bending and laser cutting of the interaction between different tubes. But, send cut send, just as one example in the US, where you can fire off a file to them and the parts turn up in the mail a few days or a week or whatever it might be later. And I mean, I think that technology, which is been paramount in really transforming the capability of what home builders can do, and you don't have to be obviously a professional to use that service as well. So I think, utilizing and leaning on those technologies that are becoming more and more available and more cost effective definitely extends the range of what people are able to do, and you're kind of able to work at a higher level, I think. I'm interested in terms of the jigs that you build these on. You mentioned sort of some fixtures before. Do you use your CAD model to also model up the fixtures that you're going to need to hold these parts in place before they're welded together?
Yeah, so that's a huge part of my business is designing fixtures. So like when I'll do a customer's full fixtured out chassis or cage for whatever they're trying to build, the manufacturability and the steps that you go through for your weldment processing is huge. So a lot of times your fixtures are going to be as complicated and sometimes as time consuming as designing the chassis itself,
Yeah, yeah,
because you're not just talking about making a fixture to assemble all the tubes in. A lot of times you're going to have to make multiple phases of fixtures. So I've had 4 phases of fixtures go on just while the chassis is upright, and then sometimes you got to flip it upside down or at an angle to fit the rest of the tubes in where you want to. And you're also thinking about you know for these guys that are doing all these high end TIG welding shops, they're looking for their guys to get really comfortable and in the position to do all these welds. And so you have to position your chassis and fixture your chassis in ways to where you can get to these welds more easily. And
yeah.
then also at the final stage of it, and you're doing your finish pass and then your second pass of TIG welding is you got to put it on a big rotisserie. So now you take your whole frame that's been tacked up and you put it on a big spinner and flip it all the way around and finish all your welds.
In terms of the welding, I wanted to sort of dive into that a little bit in the material you're using. Am I safe to assume that chromoly is the sort of material of choice for the chassis and suspension arms, etc.?
Yeah, definitely
Okay.
4130.
Now, when it gets into fabrication using 4130 chromoly, there's some considerations that need to be made, particularly around the way it's welded, and there's known cases of some pretty catastrophic failures of chromoly due to the heat affected zone around the weld and the material becoming brittle outside of the weld and actually failing sort of just alongside the weld. Uh, can you talk to us about, first of all, why that is the case, why we see those failures, and for the fabrication processes, what considerations need to be taken into account in order to reduce the chances of those sorts of failures?
Yeah, so weldment processing and weldment failures is a massively studied topic, and it's one of my favorite things to read up on. And through all my time looking at that stuff, it's pretty well researched on why these things fail. And you get, like you're saying, the heat affected zone that crosses your weldment boundary, and you go and you have a hardness gradient that plagues your weldment. And so you have a soft zone that's a little bit further out. The outside ring of your has is your soft zone, and then it progressively gets harder and harder and harder until your weld. And now, if you have any type of undercut or imperfection in your weld, right now you have a stress concentration that's really really hard next to a big soft zone. So when you're loading that, and you're doing cyclical loading or single time shock loading, you have this huge area of deformation in your soft material uh, next to a really hard stress concentration, and then you cracks and fails. So the definite solution, first off, is high quality welds. So no undercut is one of the big ones. Proper penetration is I shouldn't even have to mention it. That's of course standard. And really trying to minimize heat input is a huge one. So what I always advise my customers and what I personally practice is pulse TIG welding. So you can set up your machine to instead of just being a constant arc, it'll pulse, and so you're essentially getting the same amount of penetration without the total amount of induced heat into your system. Now, it's not going to pass the ASTM standard because that's very process controlled, but from our experience, that yields the best results for the type of tube chassis that we're putting together and various weldments that we're putting together. Now, that still has its limits too, though, right? There's always going to be a heat affected zone. And for a lot of our parts that get the worst shock loading in the worst cases, we heat treat those. And that changes that whole system.
Okay, so a couple of things I want to dive into here. So first of all, just talking about the heat input into the weld area, and And I mean, this really defines the welding process that is viable for use with 4130 chromoly, in so much as it is solely TIG welding that you'll use with chromoly construction, as opposed to using MIG where we don't have the heat control, correct?
So with MIG, you can your heat is a lot more linearly uh, controlled with your penetration, so you are kind of set to one mechanism there. But with MIG, you're tossing in a ton of extra material, so you're oftentimes building up that weld joint a lot more, and making it a lot stronger just because you're adding that much excessive material into your system compared to TIG welding.
I guess at least here in New Zealand and Australia, for those people who are constructing chromoly roll cages, I believe it is an absolute requirement that TIG welding is the only technique that will be allowed. Obviously, these rules may change in different parts of the world, but I just wanted to kind of mention the control we have of the heat input using the TIG welding process. The other element, though, that sort of goes hand in hand with this is the fit up of the parts, which I guess if you're modeling them and having them CNC laser cut and bent, that the fit up should be pretty much guaranteed. But if anyone has welded using the MIG technique, it's ideally would still like perfect fit up, but I mean it's absolutely possible to bridge a small gap, maybe a couple of millimeters. If you've got an air gap there that's not quite ideal, you could bridge that. You can do the same with TIG, but in order to do so, you're putting a huge amount more heat into that weld join than it would necessitate if it was a perfect fit up. So again, perfect fit up or a close to perfect fit up pretty much an essential when working with chromoly if you want the best results.
Unless you're heat treating, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're leaving a finished weldment without heat treatment, fitment is huge. Weld processing is huge. Cool down cycles between passes is huge. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if you're doing any seriously structural TIG weld in chromoly, you want to double pass it just because to effectively heat up and cool down the zone without overheating and creating a huge haz on your first pass, you're going to end up with a little bit of undercut. And so running that second pass back over, you're doing two things. You're providing a smooth, no undercut surface, and that weld is now a lot cleaner. You can really control the cleanliness of that weld, and it's a lot easier to weld over, right? Because you're not trying to fill a gap. So you can make really, you'll see them on Instagram all the time, all the super pretty TIG welds. But that's also a very big consideration, because the smoother the output of that TIG weld, the less stress concentration it has. And when you're talking about micro fractures on the surface level causing fatigue issues, the surface quality of that weld is really important. So not having any small types of pitting or any types of you'll even see in some books like the failure mode will cause from a fracture because in some aerospace weld, the beads weren't consistently spaced on the TIG weld. So you'll see one is further away than the other, and that makes us enough of a stress concentration on this real low factor safety part to where that is the failure mode.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so it's making a pretty weld is a stronger weld in a lot of
There's
cases.
there's a lot that goes into this. All right, so now I want to get into heat treatment, because you sort of mentioned that this is an important element. So there's a consideration here. I mean, we'll get into what the heat treating process does, but it's not something that's viable, I'm at least guessing here, in most conditions for the entire chassis that's welded from 4130. But if you're talking about a hub that's fabricated, or maybe a suspension arm that's fabricated, then absolutely it is. So what is heat treatment? What does it do, and how does it change the structure of a welded chromoly part?
Yeah. So in real, easy terms, you're talking about essentially taking your whole finished weldment and baking it, putting it in a furnace, and getting it hot enough for a long enough period of time. And it all depends on the material that you're trying to work with, to where it fully anneals the whole part. And so that stress relieves the entire part. It's all super soft. Any of the tension that's built up from the grain dislocation from the hardness when you're welding all relieved. And so you'll commonly see that as fully annealed. And then you have the hardening process to where you heat it up to a certain temperature and cool it down at a certain rate. And oil quenching, water, sand. There's tons of different ways, or salt, I should say, and tons of different ways to harden the part. And then you go through and temper it, which is baking it at a certain temperature to soften it back to a desired range. And that process essentially turns your weldment, which has all these gradients of hardness and grain dislocation, and conforms it back down into a single material. So all the grains are going the same direction. The material doesn't have any, tight bound hardness variations. It's like a machined part, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And again, coming back to the chassis side of things, really, it's an inability to fit the entire chassis into a furnace to heat treat it and stress relieve it like this. I'm guessing maybe there are furnaces big enough to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. It depends on how much money you have. There definitely are furnaces.
Yeah.
But we've gotten quotes from, and it's very, very expensive because the furnace will just be for your chassis, and to get a whole batch just for your part is very expensive. But it's also a big advantage in a design driving factor from the manufacturing side of things to try and section out your chassis. So the way that I design and a lot of other guys now design cars is they'll design a front bulkhead and they'll design certain chassis segments. And a lot of that is, especially for a front bulkhead, is so that you can go get that heat treated. And you gain a ton of mechanical properties from that material being uniform now, and sometimes harder or softer, however you'd like it.
I'm guessing as well, in terms of repairing damage, is that an advantage in so much as you could just unbolt that and replace it? Or is it still sort of not quite that easy?
Well, yeah, well, if it was bolted, sure. But for a lot of the stuff that I'm specifically working on, it's like it'll still be a welded feature, but
Oh,
it'll be
okay.
a large assembly weldment onto the next piece. So you move down, all your impact loads and all. You put your weldments on areas where it's not seeing the worst load.
All right. Just to cycle back to sort of heat treating, hardening, tempering, and I mean for the uninitiated here, we talk about ranges of hardness. On face value, you think, well, let's make it as hard as we can. Surely that's the best. So there's a little bit more to it than that. Maybe can you talk to us a little bit about levels of hardness and pros and cons?
Yeah, it's all process dependent, right? So if you're trying to make a part that has high cyclical loading, has high impact impulse loading, you don't want a very hard part, mainly because when you're dealing with, for example, like a lower control arm that is getting smacked on everything. If you're hitting a rock, you're hitting it on you're hitting the leading edge of your lower control arm, or the front braking edge of your bulkhead. And if that part's hard, it's also very brittle and it's going to crack and it's going to deform, it's going to tear. So you want it to be fairly soft and deform and absorb the energy. So a lot of it is about energy management in the actual deformation. So, you can think about modern cars, they have huge crumple zones. We kind of do the same thing with material deformation in our control links and things like that. So there'll be certain sections that are designed to have certain gaps so that when they bend and crush, they're taking up the brunt of that energy before it's transferred to the section of the control arm that controls the geometry. Or on a skid plate, you'll gap a skid plate or intentionally use a softer material that will deform before your geometrically constrained features.
Hmm.
So like we'll have a big aluminum skid plate or a UHMW plastic skid plate. And when you hit that really hard, that's going to pancake out, crush, tear, and that's going to save the rest of your components.
So it's actually quite a lot of thought needs to go into how to get the best results with these parts, and just making them as strong as possible or as hard as possible is not always the best answer.
Yeah. And one of the things that is really cool too about that, there's even more levels of chess to it. All of these weldments, even if they're heat treated, they, work hard and over time. And so that's something that I chart. So I'll go through, and when I do the FEA on my parts, I'm not necessarily trying to find its mechanical limit. What I'm trying to do is find where the stress concentrations sit. And so I can come back later and map out on my part, okay, I'm going to probe these 30 different points and I'm going to map the hardness over the next 4,000 miles. And I can track the work hardening of this part in those zones, and I can accurately tell, okay, this part's work hardened enough to where it has a higher risk of failing because of the fatigue and the work hardening during a race. So let's go reheat treat this part, normalize it, do the whole cycle again, so that we know for sure that that part's going to be solid, or just replace it.
Okay, that's quite interesting. So there's a couple of elements here. So first of all, I was going to ask about finite element analysis in terms of the design of the parts. And the usual sort of question I've got around this is, how do you know, particularly for such a brutal type of motorsport, what the loads are likely to be, and what sort of safety factors do you apply? Because finite element analysis in terms of designing parts that are strong enough and fit for purpose is really a case of garbage in, garbage out. So as I see it, at least, there's a requirement to have a pretty good understanding of the loads that are likely to be experienced. Interesting you mentioned, though, more along the lines of just understanding where the stress concentrations are. And along the same lines as that, does this allow you to use FEA to therefore go through iterations of design to reduce stress concentrations or make a part that has less stress concentration in it?
Yeah, no, FEA I use it for a ton of different specific purposes, right? So I will never be able to figure out the exact load case that I can put on an upright or on a lower control arm or on a tie rod, or tie rods are a little easier, but any multi-link kind of component, because you don't know what that driver is going to do on that particular race or that test session. And you don't know how long it's going to be implemented. And there's too many factors. You're not in a controlled environment. So you have to pull every other piece of useful information from that analysis you can. And so a lot of times you'll try and figure out various vectors, loading vectors, and figure out, okay, this is probable. Full steering lock, landing off of a jump, in an incorrect position. Okay, what's my max loading case scenario going to be here and here and here? Well, I can kind of guess where that's going to sit. And my magnitudes aren't going to be right, but I'm not always trying to compare it for outright yield. I'm most of the time comparing it to another part that I know works or doesn't. And
Sure.
through that iteration process, the comparative FEA is where you're going to gain the most in terms of design. And it's a really easy kind of idiot check when you're designing a part. Like, oh, I think I can go thinner here and there. And then you just go run that analysis real quick. And okay, I've made one on that car. It's way overkill, I think. And it lasts fine. I never have replaced one. And it's raced 8,000 miles. No problems at all.
Yep.
Doesn't harden or anything. And then you can say like, oh, it's 60% worse or 20% more stiff. And it's like, okay, that gives me a direction to design down. So that's definitely the biggest part.
I'm interested with the components like a control arm, for example. Why fabricate out of chromoly versus machine from billet alloy?
A lot of failure that you see around aluminum parts is around the actual bearing surfaces. So aluminum is going to work harden a lot faster than your chromoly will. And what you're going to get from that is failure at the joint. And to overcome that, you have to make significantly bulkier parts. You have to run steel inserts because you're also running dissimilar metals on those joints, right? So at some point or another, you're going to put a steel rod end or a steel spherical bearing into an aluminum part. And now you have a hardness difference. And so when you get that load transmitted from your rod end or your spherical bearing into your aluminum alloy part, you're more likely to just mechanically deform at the mating surface rather than transfer the load down the line. So you have to increase your surface area significantly to overcome that. So your load is much more distributed. And a lot of the times that's the difference is packaging. So to make an equivalent part, it's possible, but it's bigger.
I mean, I'm guessing, traditionally one of the reasons why we'd go to aluminium over fabricated chromoly would be a weight saving. And I can't really say what the magnitude of that is likely to look like. But again, does it sort of come back down to the weight maybe not quite as critical, so the reliability and strength of the chromoly unit comes up trumps because the weight advantage doesn't offset the disadvantages that you've just mentioned?
Yeah, the weight difference is pretty much nullified
Okay.
because of that. So if you go look at the big aluminum links on a trophy truck that you'll see, I know the guys that make those, and I know how heavy those are. They're just as heavy as the steel ones that I make.
But they look cool when you anodize them, right?
Oh, they're super rad. But I'd say the biggest benefit to an aluminum part, a machine part in general, even if it is steel, is your manufacturing time and your manufacturing accuracy. On that steel fabricated link, that part's moving all over the place no matter whether or not it's in a fixture, because once it goes to heat treat and comes back, it's gonna pancake and move all over the place, even if you put it in a fixture going to heat treat. So you have a lot more repeatability and a lot more, I'd say you have an easier time swapping out parts when they're machined because they're considerably more accurate. And at the end of the day, when you're welding a complicated chromoly part, you're spending 60, 80 hours sitting welding on the bench. And if someone's paying for that, for a high-end TIG welder, you're talking about, double the price compared to even a machined billet link. So sometimes it's cheaper to get the machined part.
Yeah, that's probably a consideration that again wouldn't be immediately obvious. People understand that CNC machine parts are expensive, but yeah, the time you just said going into one of these fabricated parts would be easy to overlook if you haven't actually been there and done it yourself. Really interesting to get a consideration on those two styles of component. Sam, at this point, we really haven't talked about your business, Dobry Design, so I think it'd be a bit of a shame to finish this without diving into it. So what is it? What services do you offer? Obviously, it's pretty squarely in the off-road racing category, and size and scale, etc. Give us the 30,000 foot view.
Yeah, so Dobry Designs is kind of my personal consulting business for automotive and motorsport racing, particularly with off-road, but across the board, engineering services as far as design, analysis, implementation, big on manufacturing, manufacturing analysis, cyclical life of parts, distribution, manufacturing resources, all that kind of stuff is mainly where my business is focused, down to the prototyping level. So if it's a full car that you want, or if you just want to design in a roller chassis or something that you want to build yourself, I'm focused on tailoring that to meet your needs. Or even for the full business that has a large product line, if you're looking for, a fixture for your product, if you're looking for, something professionally drawn and specified to meet the application that you have, that's something that I can provide.
All right, let's move towards wrapping this thing up, Sam. And we've got the same three questions we ask all of our guests. The first of those is what's next in the future for you and Dobry Designs?
Right now, I've been working for probably the last year on putting together a new modular IFS bulkhead that's really Ultra4 specific. So that is starting to come around. It's got a lot of unique new features inspired from desert racing, as well as a lot of the latest and greatest stuff from off-road. So that's the biggest thing that I've been up to. This whole business for me is a passion business. It's I have a day job just like most guys do. I work at Haas Automation, so I design machine tools all day. So this is me putting in the extra 6 hours when I get home and the extra 20 hours on the weekend.
Is there an intention to make the side hustle the main hustle?
That's always the dream. If I can get enough business to where that works out, of course that's going to be where I'm trying to go.
You've got to start somewhere, so always nice if you've got a fallback of a main job that pays the bills while you start building up the side hustle. Next question for you, Sam. Is there any advice you give to a younger version of yourself to help you reach where you are today in your career faster?
I think at the beginning of my time, thinking back in kind of high school times, or even at university times, I was always afraid of going and talking to various industry representatives at conferences or at school and things like that, and not being able to introduce myself to those figures and try and pick their brain. And I think that would be the biggest suggestion that I give to myself is put yourself out there in the position to go and talk to those people who are, could possibly hire you in the future or contract your services. So that's something that I'm constantly trying to do now, is go out to all those events. And yeah, that's definitely the biggest thing for me.
I think networking is really, really important in just about any industry. And I mean, it can be a bit scary, particularly for the more introverted amongst us. I think kind of key elements here is it's important to realize that these industry professionals, maybe people that you look up to, are just people too, and probably unless you get them on a really bad day, they're not going to bite your head off. So little to risk going in and starting a dialogue. Probably the other tip I'd give is rather than sort of just rocking up to someone and sort of shaking hands and then having nothing to say, always useful if you've got a bit of a question or something you can actually start a conversation with, so that you've got somewhere to go to. So yeah, I mean, keeping those things in mind and putting yourself out there, I think that's really solid advice. Last question for today, Sam. If people want to follow you and see what you're up to, how are they best to do so?
So you can find me and all my projects at Dobry_designs. That's Dobry. You can find that on Instagram. That's the primary avenue to find me. If you want to find things related to the GenRight 4400 car, that's probably what I'm most well known for. You can find that either on the GenRight Instagram page, or you could follow Jordan Pellegrino, who's the driver and kind of my partner in crime as far as designing and building these things.
We'll put links to those accounts in the show notes as usual. And I should have probably mentioned earlier as well, we do actually have an interview with Sam, which includes some car footage as well with Connor that was shot over at SEMA. It's on our YouTube channel. So again, we'll link to that video in the show notes as well if people want to actually see what these trucks are actually capable of doing. So great to chat, Sam. Really great to get some insight into an area of motorsport I previously knew almost nothing about. So thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of Tuned In with Sam, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Luca from Australia, who has said, "Fantastic automotive podcast. It's a pleasure to listen to these and geek out on the in-depth level of detail. Great work, everyone." Well, thanks for your kind words there, Luca. Great to know that you're enjoying the podcast. And if you want to get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh tee straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our Gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a Gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.